Patterson was not genuine, but was staged to increase ticket sales and the closed-circuit viewing audience, with both men complicit in the theatrics. Stratton also cites an interview by Howard Cosell in which Ali explained that rather than toying with Patterson, he refrained from knocking him out after it became apparent Patterson was injured. Patterson later said that he had never been hit by punches as soft as Ali's. Stratton states that Ali arranged the second fight in 1972 with the financially struggling Patterson to help the former champion earn enough money to pay a debt to the IRS. After the Patterson fight, Ali founded his own promotion company named Bout. The company mainly handled Ali's boxing promotions and pay-per-view closed-circuit television broadcasts. The company's stockholders were mainly fellow Nation of Islam members, along with several others, including Bob Arum. Ali and NWBA heavyweight champion boxer Terrell had agreed to meet for a bout in Chicago on March 29, 1966. The WBA, one of two boxing associations, had stripped Ali of his title following his joining the Nation of Islam. But in February, Ali was reclassified by the Louisville Driving Board as 1A from 1Y, and he indicated that he would refuse to serve. Commenting to the press, "I ain't got nothing against no Viet Cong. No Viet Cong never called me nigger." Amidst the media and public outcry over Ali's stance, the Illinois Athletic Commission refused to sanction the fight, citing technicalities. Instead, Ali traveled to Canada and Europe and won championship bouts against George Chuvalo, Henry Cooper, Ryan London, and Carl Mildenberger. Ali returned to the United States to fight Cleveland Williams in the Houston Astrodome on November 14, 1966. The bout drew a record-breaking indoor crowd of 35,460 people. Williams had once been considered among the hardest punchers in the heavyweight division, but in 1964 he had been shot at point-blank range by a Texas policeman, resulting in the loss of one kidney and 3.0 meters, 10 ft of his small intestine. Ali dominated Williams, winning a third-round technical knockout in what's considered the finest performance of his career. Ali fought Terrell in Houston on February 6, 1967. Terrell, who was unbeaten in 5 years and had defeated many of the boxers Ali had faced, was billed as Ali's toughest opponent since listing. He was big, strong, and had a 3-inch reach advantage over Ali. During the lead-up to the bout, Terrell repeatedly called Ali Clay, much to Ali's annoyance. The two almost came to blows over the name issue in a pre-fight interview with Howard Cosell. Ali seemed intent on humiliating Terrell. "I want to torture him," he said. "A clean knockout is too good for him." The fight was close until the 7th round, when Ali bloodied Terrell and almost knocked him out. In the 8th round, Ali taunted Terrell, hitting him with jabs and shouting between punches, "What's my name, Uncle Tom? What's my name?" Ali won a unanimous 15-round decision. Terrell claimed that early in the fight, Ali deliberately thumbed him in the eye, forcing him to fight half-blind, and then, in a clinch, rubbed the wounded eye against the ropes. Because of Ali's apparent intent to prolong the fight to inflict maximum punishment, critics described the bout as one of the ugliest boxing fights. Tex Mall later wrote, "It was a wonderful demonstration of boxing skill and a barbarous display of cruelty." Ali denied the accusations of cruelty, but, for Ali's critics, the fight provided more evidence of his arrogance. After Ali's title defense against Orifali on March 22nd, he was stripped of his title due to his refusal to be drafted to Army service. His boxing license was also suspended by the state of New York. He was convicted of draft evasion on June 20th and sentenced to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. He paid a bond and remained free while the verdict was being appealed. Ali registered for conscription in the United States military on his 18th birthday and was listed as 1A in 1962. In 1964, he was reclassified as Class 1Y, fit for service only in times of national emergency. After he failed the U.S. Armed Forces qualifying test because his writing and spelling skills were substandard due to his dyslexia, he was quoted as saying, "I said I was the greatest, not the smartest," by early 1966. The Army lowered its standards to permanent soldiers above the 15th percentile, and Ali was again classified as 1A. His classification meant he was now eligible for the draft and induction into the U.S. Army at a time when the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War, a war which put him further at odds with the white establishment. When notified of this status, Ali declared that he would refuse to serve in the army and publicly considered himself a conscientious objector. Ali stated, "War is against the teachings of the Quran. I'm not trying to dodge the draft. We are not supposed to take part in no wars unless declared by Allah or the Messenger." He also said, "We are not to be the aggressor, but we will defend ourselves if attacked." He stated, "Man, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." Ali elaborated, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so? Called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights?" Ali antagonized the white establishment in 1966 by refusing to be drafted into the U.S. military, citing his religious beliefs and opposition to American involvement in the Vietnam War. On April 28, 1967, Ali appeared in Houston for his scheduled induction into the U.S. Armed Forces, but he refused 3 times to step forward when his name was called. An officer warned him that he was committing a felony punishable by 5 years in prison and a fine of $10,000. Once more, Ali refused to budge when his name was called, and he was arrested. Later that same day, the New York State Athletic Commission suspended his boxing license and stripped him of his title. Other boxing commissions followed suit. Ali remained unable to obtain a license to box in any state for over 3 years. On June 4, 1967, in the first for sports professionals, a group of high-profile African-American athletes assembled at the Negro Industrial Economic Union in Cleveland for a Muhammad Ali Summit. The meeting was organized by Jim Brown for his peers to question Ali about the seriousness of his convictions and to decide whether to support him, which they ultimately did. At the trial on June 20, 1967, the jury found Ali guilty after only 21 minutes of deliberation of the criminal offense of violating the Selective Service laws by refusing to be drafted. 26. After the Court of Appeals upheld the conviction, the case was reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1971. Ali remained free in the years between the appellate court decision and the Supreme Court ruling. As public opinion began turning people against the war and the civil rights movement continued to gather momentum, Ali became a popular speaker at colleges and universities across the country. This itinerary was rare if not unprecedented for a prize fighter. At Howard University, for example, he gave his popular Black is Best speech to 4,000 cheering students and community intellectuals after he was invited to speak by sociology professor Nathan Hare on behalf of the Black Power Committee, a student protest group. On June 28, 1971, the Supreme Court of the United States in Clay v. United States overturned Ali's conviction by a unanimous 8-0 decision. Justice Thurgood Marshall recused himself, as he had been the U.S. Solicitor General at the time of Ali's conviction. The decision was not based on, nor did it address, the merits of Ali's claims per se. Rather, the court held that since the appeal board gave no reason for the denial of the conscientious objector exemption to Ali, that it was therefore impossible to determine which of the 3 basic tests for conscientious objector status offered in the Justice Department's brief the appeal board relied on, and Ali's conviction must be reversed. Ali's example inspired many Black Americans and others. However, initially when he refused induction, he became arguably the most hated man in the country and received many death threats. People who supported Ali during this time were also threatened, including sports journalist Jerry Eisenberg, whose columns defended Ali's decision not to serve. He wrote, "Bomb threats emptied our office, making the staff stand out in the snow. My car windshield was smashed with a sledgehammer." The New York Times columnist William Roden wrote, "Ali's actions changed my standard of what constituted an athlete's greatness. Possessing the killer jump shot or the ability to stop on a dime was no longer enough. What were you doing for the liberation of your people? What were you doing to help your country live up to the covenant of its founding principles?" Recalling Ali's heavy war position, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said, "I remember the teachers at my high school didn't like Ali because he was so anti-establishment. establishment, and he kind of thumbed his nose at authority and got away with it. The fact that he was proud to be a black man and that he had so much talent made some people think that he was dangerous. But for those very reasons I enjoyed him, civil rights figures came to believe that Ali had an energizing effect on the freedom movement as a whole. Al Sharpton spoke of his bravery at a time when there was still widespread support for the Vietnam War. For the heavyweight champion of the world, who had achieved the highest level of athletic celebrity, to put all of that on the line. The money, the ability to get endorsements, to sacrifice all of that for a cause, gave a whole sense of legitimacy to the movement and the causes, with young people that nothing else could have done. Even those who were assassinated certainly lost their lives, but they didn't voluntarily do that. He knew he was going to jail and did it anyway. That's another level of leadership and sacrifice. Ali was honored with the annual Martin Luther King Award in 1970 by civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy, who called him a living example of soul power. The March on Washington in Two Fists. Coretta Scott King added that Ali was a champion of justice and peace and unity, and speaking of the cost on Ali's career of his refusal to be drafted, his trainer Angelo Dundee said, "One thing must be taken into account when talking about Ali. He was robbed of his best years, his prime years. Bob Arum did not support Ali's choice at the time." More recently, Arum stated that when I look back at his life, and I was blessed to call him a friend and spent a lot of time with him, it's hard for me to talk about his exploits in boxing because his greatness there would be paled in comparison to the impact that he had on the world. And he did what he thought was right. And it turned out he was right, and I was wrong. 91, Ali's resistance to the draft was covered in the 2013 documentary, The Trials of Muhammad Ali. In a secret operation codenamed Minaret, the National Security Agency NSA intercepted the communications of leading Americans, including Ali, Senators Frank Church and Howard Baker, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., prominent U.S. journalists, and others who criticized the U.S. war in Vietnam. A review by the NSA of the Minaret program concluded that it was disreputable, if not outright illegal. In 1971, this fight of the century with Frazier was used by an activist group, the Citizens Commission, to investigate the FBI. To pull off a burglary at an FBI office in Pennsylvania, the anticipation for the fight was unlike anything else, so they believed the security would also be focused on the fight. This raid exposed the COINTELPRO operations that included illegal spying on activists involved with the civil rights and anti-war movements. One of the COINTELPRO targets was Ali, and their activities included the FBI gaining access to his records as far back as elementary school. One such record mentioned him loving art as a child. In March 1966, Ali refused to be inducted into the armed forces. He was systematically denied a boxing license in every state and stripped of his passport. As a result, he did not fight from March 1967 to October 1970, from ages 25 to almost 29, as his case worked its way through the appeals process before his conviction was overturned in 1971. During this time of inactivity, as opposition to the Vietnam War began to grow and Ali's stance gained sympathy, he spoke at colleges across the nation criticizing the Vietnam War and advocating African American pride and racial justice. Ali based himself in Chicago. According to most close to him, his Chicago years were formative. At the time, Ali was widely condemned by the American media, with fears that his actions could potentially lead to mass civil disobedience. Despite this, Ebony magazine noted in the late 1960s that Ali's popularity had increased during this time, especially among black people. Main article: the super fight while banned from sanctioned bouts. Ali settled a $1 million lawsuit against radio producer Murray Warner by accepting $10,000 to appear in a privately staged fantasy fight against retired champion Rocky Marciano. In 1969, the boxers were filmed sparring for about 75 one-minute rounds. They produced several potential outcomes. A computer program purportedly determined the winner, based on data about the fighters, along with the opinions of approximately 250 boxing experts. Edited versions of the bout were shown in movie theaters in 1970. In the US version, Ali lost in a simulated 13th round knockout, but in the European version, Marciano lost due to cuts. also simulated. Ali suggested that prejudice determined his defeat in the U.S. version. He was reported to jokingly say that computer was made in Alabama on August 11, 1970. With his case still in appeal, Ali was granted a license to box by the City of Atlanta Athletic Commission. Leroy Johnson, Jesse Hill Jr., and Harry Pett had used their local political influence and set up the company House of Sports to organize the fight, underlining the influence power of Georgia's black politics and Ali's comeback. Ali's first return bout was against Jerry Corey on October 26, resulting in a win after 3 rounds after Corey was cut. A month earlier, a victory in federal court forced the New York State Boxing Commission to reinstate Ali's license. He fought Oscar Bonavena at Madison Square Garden in December, an uninspired performance that ended in a dramatic technical knockout of Bonavena in the 15th round. The win left Ali as a top contender against heavyweight champion Joe Frazier. Main article, Fight of the Century. Ali and Frazier's first fight, held at the Garden on March 8, 1971, was nicknamed Fight of the Century due to the tremendous excitement surrounding the bout between 2 undefeated fighters, each with a legitimate claim to be heavyweight champion. Veteran U.S. boxing writer John Connor called it the greatest event I've ever worked on in my life. The bout was broadcast to 36 countries. Promoters granted 760 press passes. Adding to the atmosphere were the considerable pre-fight theatrics and name-calling. In the lead-up to the fight, Frazier called Ali Clay. This angered Ali, so he portrayed Frazier as a dumb tool of the white establishment. Frazier is too ugly to be champ, Ali said. Frazier is too dumb to be champ. Ali also frequently called Frazier an Uncle Tom. Dave Wolf, who worked in Frazier's camp, recalled that Ali was saying the only people rooting for Joe Frazier are white people in suits, Alabama sheriffs, and members of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm fighting for the little man in the ghetto. Joe was sitting there, smashing his fist into the palm of his hand, saying, "What the fuck does he know about the ghetto?" Ali began training at a farm near Reading, Pennsylvania in 1971. Finding the countryside to his liking, sought to develop a real training camp in the countryside. He found a 5-acre site on a Pennsylvania country road in the village of Deer Lake, Pennsylvania. On this site, Ali carved out what was to become his training camp, where he trained for all his fights from 1972 to the end of his career in 1981. The Monday night fight lived up to his billing. In a preview of their 2 other fights, the crouching, bobbing, and weaving Frazier constantly pressured Ali, getting hit regularly by Ali jabs and combinations, but relentlessly attacking and scoring repeatedly, especially to Ali's body. The fight was even in the early rounds, but Ali was taking more punishment than ever in his career. On several occasions in the early rounds, he played to the crowd and shook his head no after he was hit. In the later rounds, in what was the first appearance of the rope-a-dope strategy, Ali leaned against the ropes and absorbed punishment from Frazier, hoping to tire him. In the 11th round, Frazier connected with a left hook that wobbled Ali, but because it appeared that Ali might be clowning, as he staggered backwards across the ring, Frazier hesitated to press his advantage, fearing an Ali counterattack. In the final round, Frazier knocked Ali down with a vicious left hook, which referee Arthur Mercante said was as hard as a man can be hit. Ali was back on his feet in 3 seconds. Nevertheless, Ali lost by unanimous decision, his first professional defeat. Main article, Muhammad Ali vs. Jimmy Ellis. Presenting the year 1971, basketball star Wilt Chamberlain challenged Ali to a fight, and a bout was scheduled for July 26. Although the 7'2" tall Chamberlain had formidable physical advantages over Ali, weighing 60 pounds more and able to reach 14 inches further, Ali was able to influence Chamberlain into calling off the bout by taunting him with calls of timber, and the tree will fall during a shared interview. These statements of confidence unsettled his taller opponent, whom Los Angeles Lakers owner Jack Kent Cooke had offered a record-setting contract, conditional on Chamberlain agreeing to bet. What Cooke termed this boxing foolishness, and he did exactly that. To replace Ali's opponent, promoter Bob Arum quickly booked a former sparring partner of Ali's, Jimmy Ellis, who was a childhood friend from Louisville, Kentucky, to fight him. After the loss to Frazier, Ali fought Jerry Corey, had a second bout with Floyd Patterson and faced Bob Foster in 1972, winning a total of 6 fights that year. In 1973, Ken Norton broke Ali's jaw while giving